Happy New Year. We've got an amazing UFC card this weekend to kick off 2025's betting campaign, and I'm extremely confident that we'll put another profitable year in the bank. We make a profit on everything that we do, and we know betting on the UFC is our bread and butter. I actually had one of the biggest financially winning days of my entire 15-year betting career over the Christmas period, and it wasn't on football and it wasn't on the UFC. It was actually on darts. So I'm very confident we're actually going to make a profit betting on darts in 2025 this year, which is very, very exciting. Expect to perhaps see a little bit of content pop up on the channel about darts from time to time, because we've got some more tournaments coming up in January. But we're back to our bread and butter this week, the UFC, and as you can see, we make a profit on approximately 70% of UFC events in live betting. That's my speciality, and this weekend's card is a fantastic event to live bet. It may not have the big names of next week's pay-per-view, it may not have super high profile matchups, but from my perspective, whenever you've got two human beings in the UFC octagon engaging in a cage fight to the death until the time limit is up or the referee steps in and stops it, you've got an opportunity to make a lot of money. 2025 is going to be a fantastic year for us. We make a profit every single year, and this year will be no different. And we'll do that through hard work and sticking to the core principles that have enabled us to have so much success over such a long period of time. This is one thing we've got over everyone else in the game: longevity. I've been doing this for an extremely long time now. I've been around for a long time, and I'm looking forward to adding another profitable year to my resume in 2025. So jump on board, check the links below, join the Discord, and join a winning community, man. We do great, and if you want to make a lot of money live betting on the UFC, join the team, because in 2025 we're going to crush it like we always do. So with that being said, let's not fuck around anymore. Let's dive into breaking down the main event of this weekend's card, which is going to be a rematch between Mackenzie Dern and Amanda Ribas. This is a fantastic fight that I'm really looking forward to, and it is super interesting to me because when I first saw that these two girls were fighting, I assumed that Mackenzie Dern would be the favourite. So it was quite a shock to me when I checked the odds after researching the fight and found that Mackenzie Dern was actually the underdog. This is one of those fights where I think the odds could be way off, and I think the fact that Amanda Ribas won their first fight could be having a very big influence on the odds for this matchup, because the thing about sports betting or sports in general is people are very results orientated. I will always use, sports that are very familiar to me to try and give you examples of this, but you can all think of your own examples in the sports that you love and you're passionate about that'll make a lot of sense to you. So if you're familiar with football or soccer, you'll know about the situation Manchester City are in, right? Manchester City have been the dominant force in European football for many years now, and their manager Pep Guardiola is one of the greatest managers of all time. But recently they've fallen under hard times. They went from dominating European football to putting in the kind of results in recent history, which is almost relegation for them. They're performing terribly, and now people are saying Pep Guardiola's done, he's lost it, Man City are trash, and they're in a lot of trouble, and the dynasty is basically over. And that's simply because of results on paper. In the short term, they're not performing well. People are very, very focused on results on paper. They change their long-term perspective, their long-term opinion on something based on short-term variance, short-term outcomes, short-term results that maybe don't give a true reflection of the bigger, more real picture. And I think we see that a lot in MMA. You look at a guy like Jamal Hill, right? People love to bash this guy online, make fun of him. They love to trash him. They love to, post memes of him getting knocked out by Pereira. But a big part of why people love to hate Jamal Hill is because of his cocky personality and his swag, right? The fact that he's very confident in his own ability. The fact that he goes after people on social media. But when you look at Jamal Hill's set of skills, he's young, he moves well, he's got cardio for days, he is tough and durable. He got knocked out by Pereira, but he's a durable guy if you look at his entire career in its entirety. The guy's tough as nails. He damn near had his arm ripped off against Paul Craig, wanted to continue fighting. So Jamal Hill's a great fighter, but so many people look at short-term results on paper and now write this guy off, think he is an absolute bum. So because of that, people's psychology when it comes to betting on sports is very, very results orientated. Many people that are looking to bet this fight this weekend and will be researching this fight this weekend will put a lot of weight on the fact that Amanda Ribas has already beaten Mackenzie Dern. They will look at the records and they will go, Amanda Ribas won a pretty dominant decision over Mackenzie Dern in 2019. Therefore, I'm just going to bet Amanda Ribas this weekend because if she beat her before, she can beat her again. That's the logic most people will use. But what they don't realise is that in order to reach the highest level of anything in life, you have to be very good at learning from your mistakes. You have to be on a constant journey of self-improvement. And a lot can change in the last 5 years or 6 years now since Dern and Ribas first fought. So I want to talk in a lot of detail in this breakdown about what's different between these two since they first fought, and then you'll start to understand the reasons why I like Mackenzie Dern a lot in this fight. So let's kick things off by taking a look at the odds. We can see that Ribas is around about a 1.50 favourite, which is going to be minus 200 for an implied probability of 67%. And if we take a look at the odds on Mackenzie Dern, she's going to be around an average of 2.65, which is going to be plus 165 for an implied probability of 38%. So Mackenzie Dern is 31 years old, 5'4" with a 63-inch reach. Amanda Ribas is 31 years old, 5'3" with a 66-inch reach. So we can see Ribas has a slightly longer reach. That is notable in a fight like this, to be fair, because obviously Dern's striking defense isn't the best, but 3 inches isn't a massive advantage, and I think it's going to dramatically change how these two match up when it comes to striking. So the core focus of this breakdown is going to be what's different in 2025 compared to when these two fought in 2019, and why we should view the matchup between these two very, very differently. Before we get into talking about specifics, fundamentally, in my opinion, Mackenzie Dern has improved exponentially since she fought Amanda Ribas back in 2019, and I feel personally like Ribas has regressed. If we take a look at when that first fight took place, it was all the way back in 2019. And it was actually only Mackenzie Dern's third fight in the UFC. She'd only fought Ashley Yoder and Amanda Cooper up until that point, and Ribas was a massive step up compared to both of those girls. Back in 2019, Mackenzie Dern didn't really have any striking at all. Zero striking. She was a sitting duck on the feet. This made it difficult for her to set up her takedowns, and there wasn't really any risk to Amanda Ribas in this fight when it came to striking. She could put a lot of pressure on Dern, she could let her hands go, she could stand right in front of Dern, and there was nothing that Dern could really do to deter Ribas from attacking her on the feet. So Dern got lit up on the feet, and because Ribas is a capable grappler herself, and Dern didn't have the footwork, the movement, the striking to set up those takedowns, she didn't get near a takedown either, and it was a total shutout. It was a very, very comfortable fight for Amanda Ribas. But since then, Dern has had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 fights. She's had 11 fights. And she's been in there with some of the best strawweights in the world. So she's gained a tremendous amount of experience. She's been training with Jason Perillo and working hard on her striking. And her striking in 2025, even though it's still not great, there's still issues with it, is an order of magnitude better than it was back in 2019 when she first fought Amanda Ribas. So Dern is a completely different fighter to how she was back in 2019, and a much more difficult challenge for Ribas to face. But we also mentioned earlier in the breakdown that, in my opinion, Amanda Ribas has regressed. And I don't think Ribas has necessarily regressed when it comes to her skill or technique, because she's a very good MMA grappler. She's got great cardio. Her striking's reasonably good for the division as well. For me, the area in which Ribas has declined is the mental side of the game. You know, GSP famously said that fighting was 90% mental. And this is an area where Ribas is, in my opinion, quite weak. Whereas I feel the mental side of the game for Dern is extremely strong. You know, you can question Dern's decision making in her fights, you can question her fight IQ, but you cannot question her toughness, her determination, and her grit when things get tough. You know, you look at her fights against Amanda Lemos, or Werner Jandiroba as great examples. You know, she was knocked down multiple times against Lemos, took a lot of damage, but kept going, kept fighting, wouldn't give up. She had her nose absolutely crushed against Werner Jandiroba, and again, pushed through, wouldn't give up. And of course, in her early fights, she was virtually defenseless on the feet. She took tons of damage on the feet, and yet zero quit in Mackenzie Dern, to the extent where when you look at her record, she's only been finished one time in 13 fights in the UFC against Jessica Andrade. And that's another fight where Dern tried to show a lot of heart. You know, she was knocked down before being knocked out. In fact, she was knocked down multiple times and tried to stay alive, tried to hang in there, tried to keep pushing. Amanda Ribas, on the other hand, is one of these fighters that as soon as she gets hurt in a fight, she completely falls apart. We've seen her take damage early in matchups against fighters like Maycee Barber or Marina Rodriguez, and she just doesn't have the heart, she doesn't have the will to push through, hang in there, and try to weather the storm. It's almost like as soon as Ribas gets hurt in a fight, psychologically she waves the white flag, doesn't want to be in there anymore, and looks for a way out. And if fighting is 90% mental, and fighting is just a battle of wills, with this being a 25-minute, 5-round main event, there are a lot of opportunities for Mackenzie Dern to put Ribas in bad positions, which she may not have the heart to fight through. So this is a pretty big edge for Dern in this fight, in my opinion. She couldn't make the most of it the first time they fought, because she didn't have the skills on the feet to really land anything clean or hard on Ribas, to get Ribas to doubt herself, to, you know, put that mentality to the test. And at the same time, Ribas was pretty confident back in 2019. You know, you remember all the hype behind Ribas. People were talking about her being a potential, you know, future champ. I'm not saying that can't happen, but she had this aura about her, this confidence, this swag, this charisma. And when she was knocked out by Marina Rodriguez, all that kind of disappeared, and we can see, you know, she was building some momentum, racking up wins, and then as soon as she got knocked out by Marina Rodriguez, you know, her record has looked a little bit sketchy, going 3-3 since, and losing to some relatively low-level opponents, in my opinion, like Caitlin Kermanara, and, you know, I'm not going to call Maycee Barber low-level, but there's a reason why Barber doesn't have a whole lot of finishes, is what I would say. She's not particularly dangerous, in my opinion. If we pull up Barber's record, we can see that she is a bit of a decisionator, and far less skilled fighters than Amanda Ribas, like Jessica Ai or Montana De La Rosa as examples, have managed to go the distance with Barber, yet Ribas was finished because Barber punched her really hard in the face a couple times, and then Ribas fell apart mentally. So in terms of how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, they're obviously primarily grapplers. Mackenzie Dern is an extremely high-level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner, and Ribas is a very good all-round MMA grappler with a base in Judo. But I actually think how these two match up when it comes to striking can have a pretty huge impact on how this matchup plays out. Now, in terms of technique, in terms of skill, there is no question that Amanda Ribas is levels and levels and levels above Dern. She is a far better striker than Dern when it comes to skill and technique. But if determining the outcome of mixed martial arts fights was as simple as establishing who was the more skilled fighter, then most of us here, most of you guys watching this, and myself included, would be millionaires, because this sport would be very easy to predict, very easy to make money from. There's no question that Ribas is the better striker in this fight, but it ain't all about who's the more skilled striker, the more technical striker, who looks better hitting the heavy bag. Because when you look at Ribas, while she is more technical and her footwork and movement's better, and she's better defensively, and she throws a more diverse range of strikes, and she's got nice combinations and nice kicks. And then when you look at Dern, she's very rough, she's very raw, she's very bad defensively, she gets tagged clean and hard a lot, she takes a lot of damage in her fights. The real difference between these two is that Dern actually has a tenacity and an actual power in her shots where she can actually hurt Ribas in this fight. Dern's one of these fighters that may not be the most technical on the feet, but with her work, with Jason Perillo, we now see her in a situation where she will bite down on that mouthpiece, blitz forward, and fully commit to her punches. And when she does land clean and hard on girls, she does inflict damage, she does hurt them. And we know Dern's got great cardio. She's got the cardio to go hard for 5 rounds. There's no doubt about that. And, Ribas isn't, amazingly defensively on the feet. Dern can land. Dern can absolutely land. And that's a big difference between their first fight in 2019 and their rematch in 2025. Dern can actually hurt Ribas on the feet. That's something she couldn't do in the first fight. And that changes things. That changes things a lot. So straight away, we've got a couple of reasons to like Dern here before we even get into the grappling department, which is where a big part of this fight is likely to take place. So, Dern, an order of magnitude better striking, much stronger mentally than Ribas. And when I say an order of magnitude better striking, I mean compared to how she looked in 2019. So now let's get into how they match up when it comes to grappling. So the irony of the first fight between these two is that it was kind of grappling that put the cherry on top of the victory for Amanda Ribas, because Ribas was lighting Dern up on the feet to the extent where Dern was forced to pull guard or, flop to her back on a couple failed takedown attempts in that first fight. And Ribas just totally shut her down from top position. When we see Mackenzie Dern go to the ground with a lot of her opponents, she just drowns them in a barrage of submission attempts and eventually wins a scramble, which will put them in a very bad position. It doesn't matter whether Dern's on the bottom. It doesn't matter where she is. She just has a tremendous ability to win scrambles against all the odds and put her opponents in a bad position. We saw her do it over and over again to Amanda Lemos on the ground. And so what was concerning for Dern in their first fight in 2019 is that when Ribas was on top of Dern, Dern couldn't get anything going. We know how active of a guard Dern has got. Very, very, very active guards with her legs, attacking with arm bars and triangles and rolling for legs and all kinds of stuff. Ribas just shut that shit down. And I want to show you the extent that Ribas shut this shit down so that you can appreciate that if this fight goes to the ground, there is a chance that Mackenzie Dern could get absolutely handled, which if you're betting Mackenzie Dern this weekend isn't great because grappling is obviously her base. So what I want to do, we'll just skip through and we'll focus on the grappling positions here. So we can see from this position, the end of round 1, Ribas hits a judo throw any second now and puts Dern on her back. So for many girls, going to the ground with Mackenzie Dern is a death sentence where they're going to be fighting for their life to survive and they're just hoping that the clock saves them. But that's not the case with Ribas. We can see there's only 1 minute and 11 seconds left to go in the round, but Dern's not able to get anything going here. She starts attacking with the high guard. She starts fishing for the triangle initially, and then she's trying to isolate one of Ribas's arms. But Ribas just stays heavy and tight and patient to Dern and just defends everything that Dern's doing off her back. You can see Dern's rolling for an armbar there, trying to isolate an arm, and Ribas just stays patient. She doesn't panic. She stays heavy. She stays tight. And she completely shuts Mackenzie Dern down from top position, which is something that very, 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 very few girls have been able to do in the UFC. It's very difficult to stop Dern from sweeping you after rolling for a leg or, creating a scramble off an armbar attempt or a triangle attempt. She's so tricky off her back. Yeah, if we skip through here, she couldn't get anything going against Ribas. So if we go into round 2 now, lost my mouse, there it is. If we go into round 2, skip through, we can see that round 2 ends similarly to round 1, where Dern gets in on a failed takedown attempt and Ribas puts her on the ground in a judo throw. Now Ribas almost gets her back taken there, but she's able to pivot, scramble into top position, and from here, let me just make sure you can see all good. And from here, again, she completely shuts down everything that Dern tries to do to her from top position. And again, we can just skip through. Ribas chooses to stand back up. It's whatever. Into round 3. We'll just skip through. You can kind of see round 3. You can get a feel for what happens. Failed takedown attempt here, where Dern kind of pulls guard off a failed takedown attempt. Ribas doesn't want anything to do with it. Just disengages. Stands back up. Any second now. There she goes. We skip through. Blah, 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 blah. Skip through. And that's basically round 3. So when you look at how these two match up on the ground, that fight is a huge concern for Mackenzie Dern, because what you want to be hoping if you're betting Mackenzie Dern this weekend is that her cardio, her toughness, her tenacity, her aggression will kind of break the mental will of Ribas, to the extent that Ribas doesn't like to be on the feet with Dern, because perhaps she's getting hit hard in the head, which you know she didn't like too much against Maycee Barber or Marina Rodriguez. And so then Ribas kind of goes back to her happy place, her comfort zone, her safe space, and starts to kind of mix it up in the grappling department with Dern, where she's not at risk of taking any damage on the feet. That's kind of what you want to hope for if you're betting Mackenzie Dern this weekend, because you'd expect Dern to be the more skilled, more dangerous grappler out of these two if the fight goes to the ground. Now, that wasn't the case in their first fight. You can see that Amanda Ribas totally shut Mackenzie Dern down from top position. But what might have changed in this rematch? In my opinion, the main difference between these two girls now in 2025 compared to 2019 when it comes to grappling is that Ribas has just lost her confidence. Again, she doesn't have the same presence, the same aura, the same confidence that she had back in 2019. And so if the fight goes to the ground this time and Ribas has taken some damage on the feet and maybe her nose is busted up and she's hurt and she's tired, if Mackenzie Dern starts to relentlessly attack her on the ground with submissions and constantly initiate scrambles, is Ribas going to have the heart or the determination, the drive to hang in there and compete with Dern on the ground? Because we know Dern can scramble like crazy for 5 rounds, no problem. And while Ribas's cardio is great, there's a big difference between the confidence of Ribas in grappling positions back when she first came into the UFC in 2019 compared to what we see from her, you know, in 2023 and 2024. So Mackenzie Dern's a very, very interesting bet for me this weekend. I haven't decided if I'm going to bet her yet. I probably will. Let me know what you guys think in the Discord. Let me know what you think in the comments below. This is a very, very, very interesting fight. I'm very much looking forward to seeing how it plays out. There is no way on earth I would be betting Amanda Ribas as a big favourite in this matchup. This is clearly dog or pass. You know, Ribas carrying an implied probability of 67% is just simply not a good bet. Even if she wins, I don't see where the value is. In order to get any value on Ribas, you'd have to give her a 70% or better chance of winning this fight. From my perspective, that's impossible to do if you consider how much has changed since 2019 and how much these two match up stylistically, especially considering the fact we've seen Ribas quit in a couple fights when she's been hurt. So in terms of the over-under on this one, the fight is obviously very likely to go deep. Both girls are well-rounded. Both girls are... I don't want to say durable, because I wouldn't say Amanda Ribas is durable, but you've really got to question if Dern's dangerous enough standing up or on the ground to have a serious chance of getting Ribas out of there. It's not super likely. So, you know, this fight is more likely to go to a decision, but the odds reflect that, with it being pretty steep favourite odds. I'm not going to be betting on the over-under on this one, but if I were to bet it, I would probably prefer to take fight doesn't go to a decision at underdog odds, just because you get a better payout in the odds, and we know that Ribas can be broken. We know Dern's very mean, very nasty, very tough, very aggressive, and in my opinion, if Maycee Barber is capable of finishing Amanda Ribas, then so is Mackenzie Dern. I don't like these odds on fight to go to a decision. If you look at Ribas's record, you know, They are both decisionators, but you're paying a steep price on this fight to go to a decision. 25 minutes, 5 rounds, that's a long time. So in terms of the prop bets on this fight, Dern by decision is interesting to me. Personally, I would prefer to take worse odds for more security and just bet Dern money line on the basis that if Dern does get a crazy submission on the ground, or breaks Ribas mentally with a big shot she lands on the feet, by taking the money line, you're just playing it a little bit safer, and you are not gambling as much as if you take that specific prop. So it's a very interesting fight. I'm looking forward to it. Very tempted to bet Dern. I'm very likely going to bet Dern. I haven't made my mind up yet. We'll see how it goes. Let me know what you think. So let's move on to the next one. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be one of the very few fights in the even money odds range on this card. Santiago Ponzinibbio against Carlston Harris. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds, we can see that Ponzinibbio is a slight favourite at average odds of about 1.78, which is going to be minus 128 for an implied probability of 56%. If we take a look at the odds on Harris, he's around an average of 2.05, which is going to be plus 105 for an implied probability of 49%. So Ponzinibbio is 38 years old, 6 foot tall with a 73-inch reach, and Harris 37 years old, 6 foot tall with a 76-inch reach. So both guys about the same age and about the same size, and needless to say, with both these guys being in their late 30s, they are both going to be declining from fight to fight, or at least they should be. Obviously with Ponzinibbio, we've seen clear and obvious signs that he's declined over the last few years. He's certainly not the fighter he was 6 or 7 years ago. Very few guys in their late 30s will be, but both these guys definitely in the tail end of their careers, and I do like this kind of matchmaking where you've got two old guys fighting one another instead of when they throw these older guys to these young hungry lions. So what makes this a very interesting fight is that Ponzinibbio has been in the UFC for an extremely long time. He made his debut all the way back on The Ultimate Fighter in 2013. So he's been in the UFC for about 13 years now, 12, 13 years, which means obviously we've got a lot of footage on Ponzinibbio, and we know a lot about his strengths and weaknesses, and with so many of his fights in recent years going the distance or close to the distance, we've also got a really good look at the level at which Ponzinibbio has declined. So there's no ambiguity here. We know exactly what we're getting from Ponzinibbio this weekend for the most part. Now in terms of how these two match up in terms of styles and kind of technique and skills and that dynamic, Ponzinibbio is obviously the striker, Harris is the grappler, and you'd assume if the fight goes to the ground, Harris should have the advantage. If the fight stays standing, Ponzinibbio should have the advantage. So there's obviously nuances within that which we're going to describe and discuss, but a big part of this breakdown is going to come down to whether or not Harris is going to be able to have much success with his grappling, because he is a strong offensive wrestler, very dangerous submission grappler. We saw what he did to Jeremiah Wells with that third round submission in one of his very recent fights. So what's very interesting about Ponzinibbio is he is a little bit of an anomaly, and we don't get situations like this happen very often in the UFC, but they do come along every once in a while, where you have a guy like Ponzinibbio with tons of fights, and therefore there's tons of footage available on them, but despite this, there are still certain giant question marks over certain aspects of their game. And what I'm referring to with Santiago Ponzinibbio is his takedown defense. This might sound crazy, but despite the fact that he's been in the UFC for so long and has got so many fights on his record, he's never really fought a really strong grappler, or at least hasn't fought a strong grappler for a very long time. If we look at Ponzinibbio's record, we can see he fought Salikov, who's a striker, Holland is a striker, Morono's a striker, Pereira's a striker, Neal's a striker, Bays is a striker, Li Jingliang's a striker. And those are all of his fights from the last 4 years, since, he's been on a bit of a decline. We can see he was racking up wins against some really good guys in the division, like Gunnar Nelson. Mike Perry at the time was obviously a decent level of fighter. And Neil Magny, who was decent level back in 2018. But since that layoff where he had a lot of health issues, obviously the decline has been clear and obvious. But before that, before the layoff, he also didn't really face any strong grapplers. Neil Magny, striker. Mike Perry, striker. Gunnar Nelson, very, very strong grappler. The best grappler that Ponzinibbio's ever faced. However, he got he got a knockout after just 1 minute and 22 seconds. So that fight didn't last long enough for us to learn anything really about Ponzinibbio's grappling. Nordine Taleb, for the most part, a striker. Zach Cummins, for the most part, a striker. Court McGee, fight ended very quickly. Didn't used to really grapple much back then. Andreas Stahl was a wrestler, but the fight ended in just 4 minutes. Lorenz Larkin, striker. Sean Strickland, striker. Wendell Oliveira, striker. Ryan Lafayette was a grappler, but we can't be too harsh on Ponzinibbio for that loss because it was Ponzinibbio's debut. The fight was a very long time ago, and a lot could have changed since then. So Ponzinibbio is a very strange example of a fighter who has been in the UFC for a very long time, but somehow, just with the way the cards have fallen and the matchmaking's played out, he's managed to avoid facing any really strong grapplers, which is kind of nuts because the welterweight division throughout the last 10 to 15 years has been a division that has always had a lot of very strong grapplers. And with Ponzinibbio continually being in the kind of top 10 picture for a big chunk of his career, obviously he's not anymore, but he was for a big chunk in his career. It is kind of incredible how he's gone this long in the UFC without facing any real strong wrestlers or really high-level grapplers. Whenever we've seen Ponzinibbio's takedown defense or ground game tested, it's always looked very good. He also trained at American Top Team for the vast majority of his career, which is a very high-level gym, and guys from that gym do tend to be very well-rounded. There are a few exceptions to the rule, but for the most part, if you train at ATT, you're usually pretty skilled in all areas. But it's tough to say how Ponzinibbio's takedown defense and ground game will look against a strong, physically imposing, high-level offensive wrestler like Carlston Harris. We can look to the statistics to give us some clues. We can see that Santiago Ponzinibbio has got a takedown defense statistic of 66%, which, you know, it's a very meaningful statistic because it comes from, you know, an average takedown defense over such a large sample size of fights across, you know, many different opponents that would have tested Ponzinibbio's takedown defense in different ways. But at the same time, I'm not sure if a takedown defense statistic of 66% is all that good, considering he hasn't really fought any strong wrestlers. For the most part, it would have been guys like Ryan LaFleur, or it would have been strikers for the most part hitting takedowns on him. And the one thing you've got to be careful of when you bet on these declining fighters like Santiago Ponzinibbio is that one of the things that can go when you hit your late 30s and you do start to decline quite rapidly is your balance. Some fighters, the best example I can think of is Joanna Jędrzejczyk, where some fighters just don't have that same core, that same balance, that same athleticism to defend takedowns like they did in their prime. So Jędrzejczyk's a good example because in Jędrzejczyk's prime, she had some of the best takedown defense I've ever seen. It was absolutely phenomenal. And then if you look at her very last fight against Weili Zhang, when it was clear that Joanna was on a bit of a decline, you know, her takedown defense was just nowhere near where it was earlier in her career. And so even if you can go back in time and look at, you know, examples of Ponzinibbio's takedown defense looking reasonably good in the past, doesn't mean it will be at the age of 38 years old in 2025. So you have to be very careful about betting Ponzinibbio this weekend, because if his takedown defense isn't that great at 38 years old, Harris could ragdoll him to the ground and just dominate him on the ground. I would be very, very cautious about that risk factor with betting Ponzinibbio this weekend. But on the feet, Ponzinibbio should certainly have a big advantage. He's more technical than Harris. He moves well. His cardio's not what it used to be, but he can fight at a reasonably good pace for 3 rounds. He's obviously not as durable as he used to be, but not totally made of glass either. And the one big difference that I would say about Ponzinibbio's striking now compared to his earlier fights is that he's much more gun-shy than he used to be. Ponzinibbio is one of these guys that built off a career off a lot of aggression, a lot of volume, and fighting at a high pace. But these days, you know, you look at his last fight against Muslim Salikov, he's a little bit gun-shy. He doesn't let his hands go as much as he used to. But when you look at Carlston Harris's style of striking, he's very wide, he's very raw, he's very loose, he's very sloppy. He likes to just come forward and throw big winging hooks from the hip, but he's wide open down the middle. And we know straight punches beat wide punches, and that's one of the reasons why he was brutally knocked out in his last fight against Chaos Williams. And it isn't going to be easy for Harris to bounce back from suffering such a brutal knockout such as that. I know it was a while ago back in May, but it was a pretty bad knockout, and it isn't easy for a 37-year-old brain to recover and go back to what it was when you're suffering knockouts like that at this late stage in your career. Power is one of the last things to go. We know that Ponzinibbio can hit very hard. But one of Ponzinibbio's biggest weapons when it comes to striking is obviously his leg kicks. He can inflict a lot of damage with these, and because Harris isn't a particularly skilled striker, doesn't read his opponents that well, and does stand in quite a wide stance, Harris will be wide open to Ponzinibbio's leg kicks. So on the feet, Ponzinibbio should be able to chip away at Harris and outstrike him. You know, him being gun-shy is always a concern. If Harris is more aggressive, perhaps the striking will turn out to be closer than it should be if Ponzinibbio is reluctant to pull the trigger. But if Ponzinibbio does let his hands go, if he does fight anywhere near the level that we know he's capable of, should be able to outstrike Harris relatively comfortably, and outside of Harris landing one of those big clubbing hooks that he likes to throw from the hip to knock Ponzinibbio out, Harris should be in a lot of trouble here on the feet. When it comes to grappling, things are a bit of an unknown with this one, unfortunately. I don't have enough footage on Ponzinibbio's grappling against a decent level of grappler to be able to give you a really confident prediction on how these two are going to look if Harris starts to try and take Ponzinibbio down. What I would say is that it's a great fight for live betting, and what I would also say is that Carlston Harris is very physically imposing in grappling positions, very strong, and he's got very, very dangerous chokes. So with us not knowing a whole lot about Ponzinibbio's takedown offense, submission defense, what he's like off his back, or what he's like if Harris gets to his back or in on a deep choke, for me, it's quite dangerous to bet Ponzinibbio. From my perspective, it's dangerous to bet both these guys, because if Harris can't get the fight to the ground, the skill gap on the feet is very big, and you could just see Ponzinibbio chip away at Harris, light him up, and outclass him. But the same can be said for if Harris gets this fight to the ground. So it's a tricky fight for betting. I think whoever you go with in this one, if you risk your money on either side, you are putting your money in a decent amount of danger, because there's quite a lot of unanswered questions. In terms of the over-under on this one, it's tricky. The reason why the over-under is tricky to predict on this fight is because when you have two guys that have got extreme advantages in the area that the other is weak, generally speaking, the fight is more likely to end inside the distance. And that's because wherever this fight goes, whether it's standing up or on the ground, one guy is going to have a huge advantage. Therefore, one guy has got a pretty big chance of gaining a finish in the area that they are dominant. So, for example, we know that Harris is a very low-level striker. So if the fight does stay standing, it's going to be very difficult for Harris to defend himself for 3 rounds on the feet without getting knocked out. Similarly, if Ponzinibbio is very bad on the ground and Harris has a huge advantage there, it's going to be difficult for Ponzinibbio to avoid getting choked out for 15 minutes on the ground with Harris. Fights that are more likely to go the distance are fights where you've got 2 well-rounded fighters. Whenever you have a fight like this between 2 specialists, much more likely to end inside the distance. Now, having said that, the thing that does get me a little bit interested in fight goes to a decision here is that Ponzinibbio is nowhere near as aggressive as he used to be. So if Ponzinibbio's takedown offense does hold up and this fight does stay standing, with Ponzinibbio lacking the confidence to really get after his opponents these days and really, lacks that aggressive streak that he had earlier in his career, we could see a situation where Ponzinibbio kind of plays it safe, chips away at Harris on the feet, outpoints him, takes down a safe decision. However, more likely, in my opinion, this fight doesn't go to a decision. So if you are going to bet on the over-under this weekend, I would go with fight not to go to a decision, but it's not something that I feel super strongly or super confident in, but let me know what you think. In terms of prop bets, I would be considering, if you really want to bet a little bit of money on some props to make watching the fight more interesting, Ponzinibbio by decision is an interesting one. If we look at Harris by submission, the odds aren't as good as I would have hoped. Those are a couple of things for you to think about. I won't be betting either of them myself, but I hope you found that useful. Let's move on to the next fight on this card. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Abdulrazak Alhassan versus Cesar Almeida. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Almeida is a pretty big favourite at average odds of about 1.35, which is going to be minus 286 for an implied probability of 74%. If we take a look at the odds on Alhassan, he's around an average of 3.20, which is going to be plus 220 for an implied probability of 31%. So Alhassan, 39 years old, 5'10", didn't mean to click that, with a 73-inch reach. Almeida, 36 years old, 6'1", with a 74-inch reach. So we can see that both guys are about the same size. Almeida's definitely going to be a little longer and taller, and they are definitely also in the tail end of their careers, which is a little bit of a shame because Almeida's only just come into the UFC, but he's 36 years old. He's going to be 37 years old in just a couple of months' time, and so he is going to be unfortunately battling with father time, and I'm not going to necessarily say be declining from fight to fight yet, because 36 years old isn't crazy old for the middleweight division, but unfortunately Almeida is fighting on borrowed time. He's not on as much borrowed time as Alhassan though, who's 39 years old and will be 40 years old later on in the year in August, which is going to be ancient for a middleweight. So the interesting thing about Alhassan is, even though he's 39 years old and he should be declining a lot from fight to fight at this stage in his career, some of his recent performances have actually been some of his best. So yes, he's lost some fights against Joaquin Buckley, Joe Pyfer, but going to a close decision, close split decision against someone as well-rounded, as tough as Buckley's pretty impressive. And he's looked decent against Cody Brundage and Claudio Ribeiro. In fact, he didn't look terrible in the first round against Joe Pyfer either. So Alhassan's one of these unicorns, is defying the trend somewhat of the age statistics, where we know the older a fighter gets, the worse they generally get, because Alhassan's one of these guys that has actually started to improve a little. And this is mainly due to a change in gym, a change in training partners, a change in camp. For most of his time in the UFC, he trained in Texas with Fortis MMA. I now believe he's moved to Denver, Colorado, and is training with a completely different team, which has had a good impact on his cardio. His cardio's always plagued him. It's still an issue now, but it's nowhere near as big of a deal as it was earlier in his career. So that move has definitely helped Alhassan. So he's one of those guys that is looking better than ever, really, at the age of 39 years old, which is a little crazy, but there's no denying that this is still a very tough stylistic matchup. So in terms of how these two do match up stylistically, even though Abdulrazak Alhassan calls himself Judo Thunder and technically has a base in judo, for the most part we know he's a striker. And the irony with Alhassan is that his takedown offense is actually pretty bad, and he is very, very weak off his back. Probably won't be a huge issue in this fight against Almeida, because Almeida's a pure kickboxer that's probably not going to try to take him down. But it's always good for us to know that Alhassan's takedown and ground game is very, very bad, despite the fact that he's got a base in judo. But we also know, based on the Roman Kopylov fight, that Cesar Almeida's takedown offense is also pretty bad as well. He's pretty easy to take down. And while he is better at working his way back up to his feet than Alhassan, and he does have better cardio than Alhassan, which makes it easier for him to work his way back up to his feet deeper into the fight, there are still huge issues with Cesar Almeida's takedown offense and ground game that can't be ignored. And you'd expect that, right, from a 36-year-old Brazilian kickboxer with only 7 pro fights. There's going to be issues with him. It's unavoidable. So in terms of how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, on the feet, you can never count Abdulrazak Alhassan out. He is fearless, he has big power, and he commits hard to everything that he does. While there is no doubt that Almeida is the more technically skilled striker out of the two, I will say the same about Alhassan that I said about Mackenzie Dern, and at the end of the day, Only takes one clean hard punch to land to change everything. And the thing I like about Alhassan is his fearlessness. He bites down on the mouthpiece, comes forward, commits hard to everything that he does, and it probably isn't going to take much to knock out a 36-year-old Brazilian kickboxer, no matter how big of a technical skill advantage the kickboxer like Almeida has, right? It only takes one shot. He's not going to be that durable after all the wars he's had in kickboxing throughout his combat sports career. So Alhassan does pose a threat to Almeida. There's no way to get around that, and for that reason, I do think that Almeida is unbettable at these odds. There's no way that I would be betting on a 36-year-old Brazilian against a big power puncher like Alhassan at big favourite odds. It just doesn't make any sense. But at the same time, this is a difficult stylistic matchup for Alhassan because he's weak on the ground. And even though he probably won't go to the ground, Almeida is by far the better striker. And not only that, but Alhassan is one of these guys that even now he's training in Denver, Colorado, he still slows down a lot as fights wear on. Whereas Almeida, decent cardio, can fight hard, can go at a high pace, can throw a high volume of strikes for 3 rounds, no problem. And so this is a very difficult fight for Alhassan to win. The one path to victory outside of flash KO that Alhassan does have is coming into the fight with a grappling heavy game plan. Now, he never really does this, and probably because he doesn't have the cardio to execute a very grappling heavy based game plan. But Almeida's obviously a pure kickboxer. Alhassan does have a base in judo. So if Alhassan rolls back the years, goes back to basics, goes back to his base that got him to the dance, comes in with a grappling heavy game plan, he could cause Almeida some problems. I don't think it's very likely. I think this fight likely stays standing and Almeida wins a stand-up fight. But we've got to be very open-minded about all possibilities, so if certain pathways in fights do start to play out, we can be ready to capitalize on that in live betting. And that's one of the big reasons why we've made so much money live betting on the UFC over the years, and why we make a profit on approximately 70% of events over the long term, over the last 8 or 9 years, which is obviously a tremendous return. So that's pretty much how I see this one. It is dog or pass in my opinion, just because of how bad the odds on Almeida are. Betting this guy at odds of 1.36 really doesn't get me excited, but at the same time, I don't give Alhassan that good of a chance of winning. You're putting your money in a lot of danger if you do bet him this weekend. In terms of the over-under, I think we actually have odds on the over-under for us to even talk about it. I will use these odds, 2.50, 1.50. We'll go with that. Because of how bad Alhassan's cardio is, because of how dangerous both guys are on the feet, I would be surprised if this one went to a decision. If you look at Alhassan's record, you can see the majority of his fights do end inside the distance. And if we look at Almeida's record, even though he is a bit of a decisionator, he is very aggressive on the feet. And when Alhassan does start to get tired, I think he is going to struggle to defend himself. And Almeida will probably, go in for the kill when it reaches that stage in the fight. Like I say, Alhassan's cardio has got better in recent years, but it is still an issue for him. And the Piper fight shows a little bit of that, to be fair. So, in terms of the props on this one, Alhassan is a tough fucker. So Almeida winning by decision's not impossible. The odds are just a little bit dead for me. We don't have odds on Alhassan to win in round 3. But that's something I would consider. Just because, like I say, Alhassan does slow down a lot as fights wear on. His cardio has improved, so it's likely going to be good enough to get him through the first round and a good chunk of the second round. If Alhassan can hold on till the third, pretty good chance Almeida gets him out of there in round 3. I don't know what the odds are, but when the odds are released, check your betting site. That could be something you want to consider. If the odds are like 9.0, 10.0 in that region or better, consider that as a prop. And for those of you in America that work in moneyline odds, that would be like plus 800, plus 900 or better, something like that. So I hope you found that breakdown useful. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Chris Curtis versus Roman Kopylov. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Kopylov is the favourite at average odds of around 1.38, which is going to be minus 263 for an implied probability of 72%. If we take a look at the odds on his opponent, Chris Curtis. He's around an average of 3.10, which is going to be plus 210 for an implied probability of 32%. Curtis is 37 years old, 5'10", with a 75.5-inch reach. Kopylov, 32 years old, 6 foot tall, with a 75-inch reach. So we can see that Curtis is very old now for the division, 37 years old. He's going to be 38 years old later on this year, and we would expect Curtis to be declining from fight to fight. He's also had a lot of fights, over 40 pro fights. That's a lot of damage, that's a lot of injuries, that is a lot of wear and tear on the body. Curtis isn't a guy that is showing like massive signs of physical decline, but Father Time's undefeated. That is something that Curtis is going to be dealing with. Kopylov, on the other hand, young, in his prime, and getting better from fight to fight. Obviously, Kopylov is long and tall, but quite surprisingly, both these guys are pretty much the same height and have got almost exactly the same reach. So size shouldn't play too much of a factor into this one. So in terms of how these two match up stylistically, obviously they're both primarily strikers. You would, for the most part, expect this to be a stand-up fight. Chris Curtis never tries to take his opponents down, and his weaknesses are obviously on the ground. We saw that in the Brendan Allen fight. With the case of Kopylov, Kopylov is a pure striker. He is very low level on the ground, but in some of his recent fights we have seen him mix things up a lot more. If you go and watch his fight against Cesar Almeida, his last matchup in which he won by split decision, Kopylov did use a grappling heavy game plan in that fight, which, to be fair, was pretty smart, because even though Kopylov is a skilled striker, Almeida's also a skilled striker, and so rather than stand and bang with Almeida for 3 rounds and probably get drawn into a very close competitive fight, Kopylov switched things up, used a grappling heavy game plan, and was able to use his grappling to steal rounds against Almeida and ultimately steal a decision in a very, very close fight that, to be fair, could be scored either way. Now, what's interesting about that game plan and strategy for Kopylov in that fight is that it could potentially be effective against Chris Curtis. Curtis's takedown offense isn't the best. He's a lot harder to hold down and control than Almeida, but at the same time there are issues with Curtis on the ground. Now, Almeida's one of these guys that, because he comes from a traditional kickboxing background, he would give up takedowns very cheaply against Kopylov. And when Kopylov would get into top position, Almeida would kind of lie on his back, not really make much of an effort to get back up to his feet. That is notable to me because we know Kopylov is a pretty low level on the ground. You know, we've seen big issues with his grappling in the, if we look at the Albert Duraev fight and also even the Carl Roberson fight. I mean, you know, I know the fight was a long time ago, but being submitted by Carl Roberson, who's also a pure kickboxer, it is red flag city. So even though Curtis does have issues on the ground, he is a very well-rounded mixed martial artist. He's a primary training partner, at least was a primary training partner of Sean Strickland for a long time. He's had almost 40 pro fights. So when Kopylov used the grappling heavy game plan against Almeida, I think Almeida was just too low of a level grappler to do anything about it. And so it didn't matter that Kopylov was also a low level grappler, because just by being that slight bit better than Almeida and being the guy in top position, it gave him a huge edge. If this fight did go to the ground, as bad as Curtis is on the ground, I wouldn't rule out the possibility that Curtis does hit some reversals, win some scrambles, and potentially causes Kopylov some issues on the ground. I mean, we also saw Kopylov submitted relatively recently against Anthony Hernandez. So, you know, quite often when we get these low-level grapplers with a base in striking suddenly start to grapple, at times they can get a little bit overconfident and get carried away, or they can get caught in bad positions and exposed a little bit. So, on the ground, I don't think Kopylov is going to be able to have as much success with his grappling as he did against Cesar Almeida. But we would expect this to be a stand-up fight. And the interesting thing about how both these guys match up is Curtis is a very high-pressure fighter, likes to take control center of the octagon, walk his opponents down, force them to fight in that uncomfortable range. And Kopylov will be quite happy with this because he's predominantly a counter striker that likes to use his length and bounce around on the outside. I know both these guys have got a similar height and reach, but Kopylov's got that long, tall, lean body type, does use his length pretty well. So what you're likely to see on the feet between these two is Curtis holding the center of the octagon, walking Kopylov down, stalking him around the cage, and you're going to see Kopylov light on his feet, bouncing around on the outside, stinging Curtis with big body kicks and those, long straight punches, those jabs that he likes to throw, and basically trying to outpoint Curtis from the outside. So where this fight gets interesting is Kopylov is one of these fighters that at times has slowed down quite a lot. Now, he tends to slow a lot in fights where there's a lot of grappling. His cardio in stand-up fights tends to be pretty good. But if you look at fights where there's been a lot of grappling, such as the Cesar Almeida fight, or the Anthony Hernandez fight, or the Albert Duraev fight, these are 3 fights in which he's gassed out very, very bad. I mean, you could even throw the Carl Roberson fight into that, but it was his UFC debut, so I don't want to be super harsh on him for how he looked, with the bright lights of the UFC on him and the octagon jitters for the first time and all that kind of stuff. But anytime we've seen Kopylov in a fight where there's been a lot of grappling, he's gassed out pretty bad. Now, this is something to think about, and that's why I think this is a great fight for live betting. If we're in my live betting group, I think we've got a good chance of making money on this fight. If you're not in my live betting group, I would ask you why the hell you're not in my live betting group, because we make a profit on approximately 70% of UFC events. Jump on board, boys, because 2025 is going to be huge. It's just an absolute no-brainer at this point. But this fight's a very interesting one for live betting because we know a lot about both fighters. And there's lots of different ways that this fight could play out. And depending on how the fight is playing out, depends on who obviously has the best chance of winning. But by knowing so much about both these fighters, when each path starts to play out, very early on, I think we're going to get a very strong read on this fight and have a real good chance of hitting a winner in live betting on this one. So I'm going to try and talk you through this fight as best I can for those of you that aren't in my live betting group, so that hopefully you can use that to make your own betting decisions and maybe make a little bit of money on this fight. So, anytime we've seen Kopylov forced to grapple a lot, he's gassed very bad. We know that Chris Curtis is a cardio machine that can go hard for 3 rounds, no problem. Kopylov's cardio when striking is generally very good. But the fact that he slows down a lot whenever he's forced to grapple indicates that if you do make him work hard, he is the kind of guy that will fade and slow down. And there's more than one way to skin a cat, right? Obviously, grappling is very draining. It probably takes more energy than anything else, in mixed martial arts, because you're using every part of your body. You're exerting a lot of energy, right? Kopylov has shown us that he doesn't have the cardio to grapple hard for 3 rounds. He's shown us that he can strike for 3 rounds without slowing down. But we also know that Chris Curtis is a high-pressure fighter that likes to smother his opponents in pressure on the feet, crowd them on the feet, cut the octagon off, get in their face, and just give them no space to breathe. That is a pretty effective way of also tiring opponents out. We've seen guys build careers off this style of fighting. Nate Diaz, Nick Diaz, Tony Ferguson, some of the best to ever do it with this style. And so, just because in the past Kopylov has seen his cardio hold up just fine in stand-up fights, don't be so sure it'll hold up as well against Curtis if, this is a big if Curtis can sustain that relentless pressure. Because the one issue with Curtis is that he gets frustrated in fights and eases off the pressure. So if we think about the fights where Curtis has probably struggled the most, the Jack Hermansson fight is a great example. We could see Kopylov using a similar game plan and strategy that Jack Hermansson did to cause Curtis problems, right? Because Kopylov has kind of got a similar style to Hermansson, where he can bounce around on the outside and counter strike and use Curtis's forward pressure against him to just chip away at him, point fight from the outside. That's a very effective strategy that Hermansson used, very effective strategy that Kopylov could use. But one of the things that made that strategy look so effective for Hermansson is that Curtis kept getting frustrated and easing off the pressure. He would walk Hermansson down and load up on a big shot and try to draw Hermansson into an exchange. And Hermansson wouldn't play that game. He would just circle away, reset in the middle of the octagon, and stick to that counter-striking game plan. And this frustrated Curtis, because when Curtis would come forward and cut the cage off and get into a position where he could let his hands go, Hermansson would just circle away from him, and Curtis was getting frustrated by the fact that he couldn't land anything. And because of that, he started complaining to the ref, complaining to the crowd, looking visibly frustrated. And essentially when he's doing that, he's easing off the pressure. If you think of the really effective pressure fighters in UFC history, again, Nate Diaz, Tony Ferguson, and of course, if you haven't been watching the sport for very long, you'll probably be like, what the hell is this guy talking about, right? Nate Diaz, Tony Ferguson, they're absolute bums. I'm on about a prime Tony Ferguson, a prime Nate Diaz. The thing that made their strategy, their style so effective is that they were just relentless. They wouldn't give you space to breathe. They would stay all over you for the entire duration of the fight. And that was exhausting, because eventually when you're circling away from your opponent under constant pressure, it's gonna zap all your energy. You're gonna get tired. And so just because we haven't seen Kopylov gas out in a stand-up fight doesn't mean he won't under heavy pressure from Curtis. But this is where this fight becomes really, really good from a live betting point of view, because we've got to be able to read the level of pressure that Curtis is going to sustain, right? Because say, for example, Curtis comes out, puts a lot of pressure on Kopylov in round one, doesn't have a whole lot of success with landing very much, but keeps that pressure on Kopylov for the whole of the first round, to the extent where Kopylov has to burn through a lot of energy to circle away from Curtis and counter-strike, right? In that situation, we can say to ourselves, you know, if Curtis keeps this up for the next 2 rounds, then he's probably going to wear Kopylov down. He's got a good chance of backdooring a decision in rounds 2 and 3. We can say that. But what happens if after 2-3 minutes into the second round, you know, Kopylov is just starting to get tired, but instead of pushing through and continuing the pressure and the aggression, which would then lead to Kopylov becoming very tired towards the end of round 2 and would open the door for Curtis to backdoor a decision, what if Curtis does what we saw from him in the Hermansson fight, where he starts getting frustrated and complaining that Kopylov won't stand and bang, and he starts inviting him to the centre of the octagon with the Max Holloway gestures and just kind of blows his opportunity to win. That's my big issue with Chris Curtis. I think if he did come in with a high pressure style, I think he'd stand a great chance of beating Kopylov, because I think Kopylov is the kind of guy that would fade under that kind of onslaught. But the problem with Curtis is he gets frustrated too easily. So if you're live betting this fight this weekend, you've got to be able to read the body language of Curtis and how both guys are moving, their breathing patterns, their body language. You got to be able to read, you know, any subtle changes in the way Chris Curtis is kind of carrying himself in the octagon to avoid potentially taking a loss on this one. But I'm very confident we're going to be able to snipe a profit on this fight, boys. I'm optimistic for our chances of making some money. So the other issue with Curtis that we do have to point out is Curtis is a pretty good boxer. So he's got a good jab. He's got good combinations. He's got, you know, decent hands. The problem with Curtis, though, and again, this kind of stems from his tendency to get frustrated very easily, is that he does have a habit of headhunting a little bit too much. So Chael Sonnen famously said, when you try to knock your opponent out, you often end up losing a decision. And what he means by that is, obviously, when you are setting your power strikes up with jabs and combinations and kicks, it's a lot harder for your opponent to read you and see that power strike coming. And the shots that knock you out are the ones that you don't see coming. When a fighter stops setting up their power strikes, when they stop throwing the jabs, the combinations, the kicks, and they just start headhunting their opponents, stalking them around the octagon, looking to load up on that big singular right hand, they become a lot easier to read, because their opponent knows every time they come forward, I need to be looking for that power right hand. I've got nothing else to worry about, and they can kind of just circle away from that, defend against it all night, and it's a pretty easy problem to deal with. Chris Curtis does fall into the trap of headhunting a little bit too much for me. Despite the fact he's a very good striker, a very good boxer, he does get frustrated and reach the point in fights where he kind of stops setting his power punches up and just starts loading up. And he becomes very easy to deal with when he does this. And if he does this against Kopylov, I think Kopilov's going to be able to dance around him all night, chip away at him from behind that jab and those long straight punches and just light him up with kicks. I think it'll be an easy fight for Kopylov. So from a pre-fight betting point of view, when we look at the odds, I understand why Kopylov is the favourite, but for me, there's no way I would bet him in this odds range. I just think if Curtis shows up and performs his full potential, which he often doesn't, but if he did, I think he could be a very difficult stylistic matchup for Kopylov. Now, the most likely outcome is that Curtis stalks Kopylov around the octagon, gets frustrated because he can't get close enough to Kopylov to land, gets really annoyed, frustrated, doesn't really land anything, and kind of gets outpointed from the outside like he did against Hermansson. That's the most likely outcome. But the thing is, there are enough weaknesses in Kopylov that Curtis could potentially exploit to make me not want to bet Kopylov in this odds range. I do think Kopylov's cardio could be an issue, especially if Curtis comes in with a very heavy pressure, very aggressive style, which sometimes he does, often he doesn't. In terms of most likely outcomes though, very, very likely this fight goes to a decision, in my opinion. If we take a look at Curtis's record, we can see he's an absolute decisionator. He's gone to a decision in 5 of his last 7 against some of the best fighters in the division. And if we look at Kopylov's record, even though a lot of fights have ended inside the distance, styles make fights, and we know Curtis is very, very tough. For me, Kopylov does have the odd knockout here and there. He obviously is a dangerous striker, but I would classify Kopylov more as a volume striker than a power puncher. Yes, he's got the odd knockout against guys like Josh Fremd, Claudio Ribeiro, but when he does get finishes, it tends to be against quite a low level of opponent or guys that become too tired to defend themselves. And against a tough, well-rounded fighter with a good chin, good cardio like Curtis, I think it's quite likely this fight goes to a decision. The odds are a little bit too steep for me to pull the trigger on that, but I wouldn't be betting on this one to end inside the distance. If you do want to bet the over-under, pay the price, pretty steep odds, pay it anyway, and bet on this fight to go to a decision. In terms of most likely outcomes for a prop bet to make watching this fight more interesting, if you want to sprinkle a little bit of money to have something to get you excited while this fight's taking place, perhaps sprinkle a little bit on Curtis by decision, odds of 6.0 plus 500, or better yet, don't get greedy and just take Curtis moneyline in the event that something crazy happens, like an injury to Kopylov, or a cut that results in a stoppage, or flash KO, or something crazy like that. So hope you found that breakdown useful. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be UFC debutant, the undefeated Austin Bashi against Christian Rodriguez. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Austin Bashi is the favourite at average odds of about 1.36, which is minus 278 for an implied probability of 74%. If we take a look at the odds on Christian Rodriguez, he's around an average of 3.15, which is going to be plus 215 for an implied probability of 32%. This is a very, very interesting fight. Another fight that could be very good for live betting. So again, if you're in the live betting group, good chance we're going to snipe a winner on this one. If you're not in the live betting group, join the live betting group, because we're going to have a huge 2025 and we make a profit on the vast majority of events. But this is the kind of fight which is very difficult to predict before the fight takes place. But very early on in the matchup, I think we're going to get a very strong indicator as to how this one's likely to play out, which should enable us to snipe a strong position in live betting. So this is an interesting fight because in some ways the UFC have been a little bit cruel with this matchmaking, but in other ways it is a fascinating fight from a stylistic point of view. So Bashi is 23 years old, 5'6" with a 70-inch reach. Rodriguez is 27 years old, 5'7" with a 71-inch reach. So we can see that both guys roughly the same size. There is a bit of an age gap. We can see that Bashi is 4 years younger than Rodriguez. And this is one of those situations where I do think that gives Rodriguez the edge. He's just got that experience. It's not easy to make a UFC debut at 23 years old. Octagon jitters, performance anxiety. It's not easy going to be fighting under the bright lights of the UFC for the first time. So that does benefit Rodriguez a little bit in this one, especially because he's a tough guy with good cardio, and he's very, very well rounded. So the reason why this is such an interesting fight is because Austin Bashi, in terms of styles, I'm not saying he's the same level as the names I'm about to mention, but in terms of styles, Austin Bashi's style is very similar to a Jonathan Pierce or an Isaac Dulgarian. Now, Rodriguez struggled very badly against both these guys. He lost to Jonathan Pierce, and he should have lost to Isaac Dulgarian. Even though the third round of that fight was very dicey for Dulgarian, he still did enough to win the first 2 rounds, and he should have won that fight 2-1. This was one of the most scandalous decisions of last year, in my opinion. It was really fucking bad. I remember MMA Guru going off about how bad of a decision this was, and I completely agree with him. It was a pretty rough decision. So realistically, Rodriguez has lost against 2 opponents with a very, very similar style to Austin Bashi. And that style is obviously relentless grappling. Just wet blanket, grab a hold of you, stick to you like glue, smother you in grappling pressure. That's what Bashi's like. He's a relentless grappler. He doesn't really spend too much time striking. He just comes out, grabs a hold of you, tries to ragdoll you to the ground, take you back, and just beat you up from back control or get on top of you. That's basically what Bashi does. Now, how effective is that style going to be against Christian Rodriguez? That's not an easy question to answer, because the thing about Rodriguez is, even though Dulgarian and Pierce have had a lot of success against him, what Rodriguez did against both guys was force them to work extremely hard. Because Rodriguez is one of these guys that isn't easy to take down, but he does give up a lot of takedowns. Where Rodriguez gets difficult to deal with for grapplers is that he's very good at defending himself on the ground. He's got an active guard. He's very scrambly on the ground, and he's difficult to hold down and control. Rodriguez is one of these guys that if you take him down, he's very good at working his way back up to his feet. And that can be both exhausting for grapplers and demoralizing. It's exhausting because they have to exert all this energy to take their opponent down. And then if their opponent quickly works back up to their feet, they're like, oh my fucking God, now I've got to dig deep and commit a load more energy to get the fight back to the ground, only for him to potentially just stand back up quickly again, right? That's demoralizing for grapplers. That's also very tiring for grapplers. So that's why Rodriguez has made life difficult for Dulgarian and Pierce. And the thing about Rodriguez is his cardio is excellent. We saw that in the Dulgarian fight. Dulgarian stuck to him like glue, ragdolled him for the first 10 minutes of that fight, and yet Rodriguez gave Dulgarian absolute hell in that third round. So where this fight becomes difficult to predict is because Bashi, up until this point of his career, has only fought a very low level of opponent. He's undefeated at 13-0, but if we take a look at his record, almost all of his wins have come in very small promotions, lights out championship, whatever this is, and he's got a win over a guy that was 8-2 on the Contender Series. So the problem when we're assessing the skill level of a guy like Bashi is that when he's facing these low-level fighters, records of like 15-23 and 9-6 and shit like this, because Bashi fundamentally is a very skilled grappler, and he's a young guy, so he's got natural energy and reasonably good cardio, he can just come out, grab hold of these guys, take them down, beat them up on the ground or get to their back, and they don't really offer up that much resistance. They don't make him work that hard for takedowns. They're not particularly effective at defending themselves on the ground or working their way back up to their feet. So similarly to what we were saying with, Amanda Ribas having a pretty easy time and being in total control in her first fight against Mackenzie Dern in 2019, it's kind of what we've got from Bashi in his 13 pro fights so far. He just comes out, establishes dominance, establishes control, and his fights have been very easy for him. Now, that's partly because of how good he is, but also to some degree partly because of how bad his opponents are. And that means we haven't really seen Bashi tested or forced to work hard or get past someone with decent takedown defense. We haven't seen Bashi have to exert a lot of energy to get a takedown or use chain wrestling or persistent grappling to maintain grappling control. We haven't seen him on his back. And so this is one of those fights where I think it is going to come down to Bashi's cardio who wins. If Bashi has got the cardio to grapple hard relentlessly for 3 rounds, he'll probably wet blanket Rodriguez, ragdoll him, out-hustle him in grappling positions, and just wet blanket him on the way to a win. The problem is, Rodriguez is very good at forcing guys like Bashi to burn through a lot of energy trying to use their grappling. And Bashi will never have experienced anything like this in any of his previous fights, and it's a very hard thing to train for, especially when you experience it for the first time under the bright lights of the UFC in your UFC debut. It will help Bashi that he's fought on the Contender Series. Obviously, this week's event is in the Apex, so that helps Bashi a little bit to take away from some of that performance anxiety. He's fought in the Apex before, but at the same time, he's facing a huge step up in competition here against Christian Rodriguez. This is a tough stylistic matchup. So this is a very good fight for live betting. Very, very good. Difficult to predict before the fight takes place because it's very difficult to bet Bashi at big favourite odds because without knowing what his cardio is like, it's possible he could adrenaline dump early if he's working really hard for takedowns and Rodriguez keeps popping back up to his feet. Bashi could panic, adrenaline dump, and we could see a momentum swing like we saw in the 3rd round of the Bulgarian versus Rodriguez fight, but it could come way earlier in this fight against Bashi because Bashi is a lot less experienced and a much less skilled grappler than Bulgarian, in my opinion. So you can't bet Bashi at steep favourite odds because there's too much risk and too little reward. On the flip side, if you do bet Christian Rodriguez this weekend, you're taking a big gamble because you have seen him struggle very, very bad against 2 fighters that have the exact same style as Austin Bashi. So while I do think this fight is dog or pass, I do think if you want to bet this matchup, you have to take Rodriguez. This is the kind of fight that is perfect for live betting because when you live bet it, you will get answers to these unanswerable questions right now. And that is why we make a profit almost every week live betting on the UFC over the last 9 years because we're patient enough, smart enough to just do our research, do our homework, understand the stylistic matchup between the 2 fighters and their strengths and their weaknesses so that when the fight's taking place, we can snipe those winners in real time. That's where the money is. That's why we've made so much money over the years. Difficult fight for pre-fight betting. Perfect for live. Save this one for live betting. If we take a look at the over-under on this fight, my instinct tells me that this fight is more likely to go to a decision simply because Rodriguez isn't that dangerous. He's more of a volume striker, and the first half of this fight will probably see him get wet blanketed quite bad until Bashi potentially slows. But what we do know is that Rodriguez's submission defense is brilliant. We've seen that in the Pierce fight. We've seen that in the Bulgarian fight. So even though Bashi is a dangerous submission grappler, I would be surprised if he could submit Christian Rodriguez. Rodriguez has very, very good submission defense. So the other way that this fight could finish is obviously if Bashi were to be finished himself. And with Christian Rodriguez being more of a volume striker, the only way that I could see this fight ending inside the distance is if Bashi's cardio is really, really, really bad and Bulgarian kind of wears him out and gets a late 3rd round finish. But I don't think that's all that likely because even though we haven't seen Bashi tested that much in past fights, his cardio still looks all right to me. You know, I don't know if he's going to be able to keep up with the pace Rodriguez sets for 3 rounds, but I don't think we're going to see Bashi completely gassed out of his mind and in a position to be finished either. Could be wrong. You never know. So in terms of prop bets, I would be scouting a bet on Rodriguez to win in the 3rd round if the odds are juicy enough, if they're like 10.0 plus 900 or better. But we don't have odds for that at the moment for some reason. They're not released yet. So can't really give you much advice on that one until we see the odds. So I hope you found that breakdown useful. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Uros Medic against Punahele Soriano. this is another one of those fights where when I researched it, in my head, I felt like at worst this fight would be in the even money odds range with the potential for Soriano to be the favourite. And then when I saw that Medic was actually a pretty big favourite in this fight and that Soriano was a decent sized underdog, I was quite surprised. And as a result, I am very tempted to bet on Punahele Soriano in this matchup. I don't usually bet on guys like Soriano. If you've been watching my content for a long time, you will know that I don't typically like to bet on guys with bad cardio. In fact, I don't ever bet on guys with bad cardio, which is why I haven't instantly pulled the trigger on Soriano. But when we get into a lot of depth on this matchup, you'll understand why Soriano is a potentially very good bet this weekend. And I'm obviously, as ever when I talk like this, going to be showing you some video footage to back up the points that I'm making. So let's kick things off by starting to take a look at the odds, because really the odds are where this fight gets interesting. If I were capping this fight, I would probably have these guys in the even money odds range. I don't lean too heavily or too confidently either way in this matchup, because I think how this fight is likely to play out really comes down to what version of Punahele Soriano we get this weekend. And we don't have a definitive answer on that. All we can do is try and make the best decision possible, the most educated guess, from a few key bits of information and a few clues that we have. So the odds on this one have got Medic as the favourite at average odds of about 1.50, which is going to be minus 200 for an implied probability of 67%. We can see that Soriano is the underdog at average odds of about 2.65, which is going to be plus 165 for an implied probability of 38%. Soriano is 32 years old, 5'11", with a 72.5-inch reach. Medic, 31 years old, 6'1", with a 71-inch reach. So both guys are about the same size, about the same age. Nothing too major in terms of X factors, although it is worth us pointing out that this is going to be Soriano's second fight in the welterweight division after moving down from middleweight. And this really is where this fight gets very interesting for me, because if we think about Punahele Soriano's career in the UFC, most of his fights up until his last one against Miguel Beza kind of played out the same way. He would come out the gate super hard and aggressive early, and he would either get a big knockout early in the fight, or he would fade very hard in round 2 and gas, and then either get stopped in the second half of the fight or lose a decision, because he was just easy to outwork when he would get tired in the second half of a matchup. And that's pretty much how all Soriano's fights played out. If you could weather the early storm, he would become very beatable in the second half of the matchup. But that changed in his last fight against Miguel Beza, where his cardio looked alright. Now, mixed martial arts is very nuanced. This is a very complex sport. There's always a lot to consider, and making money betting on any sport involves very high level thinking. So there's a lot of different ways to view this fight, and there's a lot of different aspects of it we need to consider. So if Soriano shows up and performs like he did in any of his fights in the middleweight division, which is the vast majority of his fights in the UFC, I think Uros Medic will outstrike Soriano and most likely knock him out. So if we look at Soriano's record, he's had 9 fights in the UFC. And if he shows up and performs like he did in 8 of them, I think Medic destroys him. And the reason why I feel that way is because Soriano doesn't have the cardio at middleweight to grapple hard for 3 rounds. So even if he has a bit of success with his grappling in the first round, I don't think he's going to have the energy to take Medic down in the second and third. And because Soriano gets tired and sloppy on the feet in rounds 2 and 3, I think the more technical striker in Medic will light him up bad in rounds 2 and 3, outstrike him, and more than likely knock him out in rounds 2 and 3. So if we look at Soriano's entire body of work in the UFC, it's reasonable for us to come to the conclusion that it's more likely Uros Medic wins this fight, which is probably why he's a pretty big favourite and carries an implied probability of 67%. But never forget that the devil is in the detail. The reason why we've made a profit every single year betting on the UFC since time began, and the reason why we will continue to make a profit betting on the UFC every single year until the end of time, till I die, is because we understand that the devil is in the detail. We understand that the key to making profit in this game is to see things that others do not see, to spot opportunities that most people do not see. And in fights like this, you can get hidden opportunities that most people aren't thinking about because they're not thinking on that very deep level that we are. And so, logically speaking, if a fighter has performed a certain way for 8 out of 9 fights, you're more than likely going to get the version of fighter that showed up in 8 of those 9 fights. But there's also the expression that we should never forget in combat sports, and that is that you're only as good as your last fight. What does that mean? Well, for me that means your most recent performance gives us the best indicator of what to expect from your next performance. Why is that? Because as humans, we should always be on a continuous journey of self-improvement. We should always try and be getting better at everything that we do. Learning from mistakes, getting better and improving. So if you look at Soriano's record, he's always had bad cardio. He even gassed bad on his Contender Series fight. But it didn't cost him for his first 3 fights. He won anyway. But then he fell on hard times and found himself in a position where he lost 4 of his 5 fights across this period of time. And the reason why he lost 4 of those fights every single time was cardio. Again, he would start strong and then fade. Outworked against Allen and Maximov, too tired to defend himself against Stolfutz and Kopylov. And to be fair, he was probably going to lose the Lungambula fight as well before Lungambula broke his rib towards the end of round 1 and was kind of injured, and it was a strange finish to that fight in round 2. But anyway, I digress. The point being, the Soriano lost a lot of fights due to cardio, not due to skill, because his boxing's good, he's got big knockout power, and he's an NCAA, I believe, Division 2 level wrestler. So he's got decent MMA grappling as well, he just never had the cardio to use it. It's very possible, and Soriano has spoken about this himself, that he realised that his cardio was going to cost him his career, and he fixed it. He dropped weight class from middleweight to welterweight, so he was carrying far less body weight, and he has spoken in interviews leading up to the Beza fight about how he was basically training better and living better. Now, over the years, I have been programmed to be very pessimistic and not trust fighters when they say they're going to do things that are going to lead to improvements, because a lot of the time they will disappoint you and underwhelm you. But Soriano kind of delivered against Beza. He said he was going to look a lot better at welterweight. He said he was going to have much better cardio. He said he was training better and eating better. And then when he fought Beza, he went 3 hard rounds and didn't really slow down. There is no way that the Soriano that fought at middleweight would have been able to put the kind of pace on Miguel Beza that Soriano put on him. And that gets my attention, because I think the version of Soriano that fought Beza can give Uros Medic big problems. And when we talk like this, we've got to show footage to back up what we're saying. But the devil's in the detail, my friends, and that's why we perform very well betting on the UFC and have done every single year for the last 15 fucking years. I've been here a long time doing this, and spotting little opportunities like this is where those profits come from a lot of the time. So before I show you the Beza fight, I need to tell you the reason why I'm not instantly rushing out and betting on Soriano. Because the way I view this fight is, if Soriano shows up and performs like he did against Beza, I think he should be the favourite. Probably in the odds range that Medic is in right now. 1.50 minus 200. If Soriano shows up and performs like he did in his middleweight fights, I think he should be in the odds range he's currently in. Because I can't feel totally confident which version of Soriano we're going to get this weekend, that's why I said personally I would cap this fight in the even money odds range, because the outcome of this fight is so dependent on what version of Soriano shows up that you kind of got to meet in the middle. You can't cap him as a favourite, you can't cap him as an underdog. You've just got to settle on the uncertainty and, in my opinion, have him as the even money odds range. That's where the opportunity to bet this fight and the value comes in. I don't think the betting market are accounting for the fact that this version of Soriano is potentially a difficult opponent for Medic. But why am I not rushing out on the basis that it's more likely Soriano looks like he did against Beza when he fights Medic this weekend? Well, again, the devil is in the detail, the nuance. We got to think things through. Beza made life very easy for Soriano. Very easy. So remember when we are breaking down fighters like Amanda Ribas or Roman Kopylov or Austin Bashi on other fights this week? In those breakdown videos for all those fights, what we've said is, under the right set of circumstances, and most of the time, Amanda Ribas, Austin Bashi, Roman Kopylov, their cardio is going to look just fine. Most of the time, it's going to look great. But under certain sets of circumstances, their cardio may not look so great. They may gas out, they may fade. We've certainly seen that with Kopylov. We've seen it on a couple of occasions, but not very often with Ribas. And with Bashi, it's a complete unknown. But with Soriano, we know those cardio issues were there at middleweight. And so, even though we know that the version of Soriano that fought at middleweight would not be able to put in the kind of performance that we saw from him against Miguel Beza, because he did exert a decent amount of energy, we don't know if Soriano's gas tank would have held up against Beza in the welterweight division if Beza would have made life a little bit harder for him. Made him work a little bit harder for takedowns or a little bit harder for top control. We don't know the answer to that. And we don't know the answer to how Soriano will look this weekend if Medic starts making him work hard for takedowns, and if Medic starts working his way back up to his feet when he's been taken down. Because Medic is far more difficult to take down and hold down than Beza. And that's where the risk comes in. So what I want to do now is show you a little bit of footage of Soriano from the Beza fight, so you can take a look at his cardio for yourself and you can see kind of the pace that he fought at. We're going to skim through the fight. Obviously, we don't want this breakdown to be super long, but with the skimming, you'll kind of get a read on the kind of energy Soriano was exerting. We'll stop periodically throughout each round so you can kind of see Soriano's breathing patterns and body language and energy levels and all that kind of stuff. And then what I want to do is show you a little bit of footage on Uros Medic's takedown offense and ground game, so you can see the opportunities in this fight for Punahele Soriano if he shows up and performs like he did against Miguel Beza with a reasonably good gas tank to go with it. So what we're going to do is fire this up, which is obviously Soriano versus Beza, and we're just going to skim through. So here we go. We're just going to skim through, and as you can see, early in the fight, Soriano is not finding it that easy to get a takedown, but then Beza makes the mistake of trying to defend quite a deep takedown attempt with a guillotine, which means he gives up the takedown. If we just skim through, Soriano, for the most part, is in top position. There's this funky leg lock position, but for the most part, Soriano spends a good amount of time in dominant positions, wins a round, blah, blah, blah. Round 2. So, if we go, say... So here again then, Beza makes the same mistake, giving up a cheap takedown here from trying to defend a takedown with a guillotine. And then again, Soriano just kind of smashes in from top position. So, even though we're only skimming through this, what you can see from this footage is that Soriano's had to exert a decent amount of energy in the 7.5 minutes since this fight's been running. Right? It's been contested at a decent pace. So when they disengage from this position, just pay attention to the breathing patterns, the body language, the energy levels of Soriano. Like here, you know, this is 45 seconds left to go in round 2. Beza stands back up to his feet with a bit of a cage grab, but Soriano's still got the energy to drive in on his legs. Yes, Beza flopped to his back very, very easily, but it's not like Soriano's completely gassed out of his mind, which he would have been at this stage in the fight at middleweight. So at the end of the round, and we get an opportunity to see how Soriano looks, he gets back to his corner. He doesn't look crazy gassed, he doesn't look crazy tired, he kind of walks over there just fine. It's obviously a shot at Beza. If we look at the beginning of this round, obviously what you want to do here is pay attention to the breathing language, the breathing patterns, the body language, the movement of Soriano, all that stuff. So they touch gloves. And you can see here Soriano's moving all right. Like if you go and look at Soriano in the 3rd round of his middleweight fights, he looks absolutely dreadful. The problem is, as soon as he shoots in on the legs of Beza, Beza gives up a very, very cheap takedown and then just flops to his back. So we don't really get to see Soriano tested. But you can see he works at a decent pace, exerts a lot of energy, and doesn't slow down for the full 3 rounds. So the question is, how would Soriano's gas tank have held up there had Beza made him work a lot harder for those takedowns? Now, in order to see how effective Soriano may be with his offensive wrestling, with that NCAA Division 2 level wrestling, what we need to do next is take a look at Uros Medic's takedown offense and ground game. Now, this is a fight that I'm not going to skim through as much, because there are specific aspects of this fight that you really need to see. So this is against Orolbai, who we know is a very good offensive wrestler with far better cardio than Soriano, and certainly a guy that can push a much higher pace than Soriano. But if we just skim through here to the grappling positions, what you're going to see in a moment is that Uros Medic has reasonably good takedown defense early in a fight. So when Medic starts shooting, you'll see good takedown defense from when Orolbai starts shooting, you'll see good takedown defense from Medic. Here you can see Medic gets that underhook in play on the right side very quickly, and then punishes Orolbai for shooting the takedown. Orolbai persists with it, and you can see Medic does a really good job of fighting for underhooks to make it difficult for Orolbai to connect his hands together around his hips. Medic also does a good job of using his length to keep his legs underneath him. And as Orolbai is trying to go for those inside trips, you can see Medic is doing a pretty good job of clearing his legs initially. Orolbai is a very good chain wrestler though. So with how persistent he was with that control of the body and the inside trips, it was going to be difficult for Medic to stuff that takedown when Orolbai was in on as deep on the legs as he was. But look at this. As soon as Medic hits the ground, he does a great job of scooting his butt over to the cage, getting his back tight to the cage and wall walking. But this is only a minute and a half into the 1st round of this fight. You can see he does a good job of wall walking back up very, very quickly. And then, you know, even though Orolbai is persisting with the takedown, again, you can see immediately scrambles over to the cage. Again, even though Orolbai is going to wrist control on the left side, which is making it difficult for him to get his back up against the cage and wall walk like he did in the example just a few moments ago, you can see the Medic has still got the energy to scramble back up to his feet relatively quickly, even under the threat of this relentless chain wrestling from Orolbai. Orolbai in on a high crotch single leg, but again, Medic is able to get his back tight to the cage and put himself in a position to wall walk. You can see him start trying to slip his legs out from underneath Allsopp here. He's posting with his right arm. Allsopp obviously going to wrist control, making life difficult for him there. But once again, it's not too long before Medic works his way back up to his feet. And you can see here he's got decent balance. He's fighting for underhooks. Medic is doing a lot of good stuff. And he gets taken down again with 1 minute and 45 left to go in the round. But again, keeps his back tight to the cage. And it isn't long before he scrambles back up to his feet. So as you can see from this first round against Allsopp, Medic is doing great. Yes, he's giving up a lot of takedowns, but he's preventing Allsopp from establishing dominant positions. He's not taking too much damage. And he's doing a really, really, really good job of quickly popping back up to his feet every time he gets taken down, to the extent where even here, a couple of times he comes close to standing back up. So, when we consider the kind of offensive wrestling that we saw from Punahele Soriano, yes, Soriano's a very good chain wrestler. Yes, he's a very good offensive wrestler, but he's not as good as Allsopp. He's not as persistent. His chain wrestling's not as good. And we know that if Medic has that much success stuffing the takedowns of Soriano, which he's likely to because he's done it with Allsopp, then Soriano is going to burn through far more energy against Medic in round 1 than he did against, what's the guy's name? Miguel Beza in round 1, because Beza didn't make Soriano work anywhere near as hard as Medic for those takedowns. So that's something we got to bear in mind. But the version of Medic we get in this second round against Allsopp is very different. Watch this. So in round 1, Medic would give up a lot of takedowns, but then he would show a lot of urgency to work his way back up to his feet. Look at what's different in this round. So here we go. Allsopp gets a takedown about 35 seconds into round 2. And you can see Medic, unlike in round 1, where he's working hard for those underhooks and he's fighting hard to keep the fight standing, here he kind of waves the white flag and just flops to his back, gives up a very, very cheap takedown. Now from here, based on the first round, you would be expecting Medic to get his back tight to the cage and to show a lot of urgency to wall walk back up to his feet. But that isn't what happens at all. You can start to see his guard looking very weak. And to me, from here, it's almost like Medic has been mentally broken and he's looking for a way out. We see Allsopp almost mount him there. Now he's got to the mount position. The position of the cage is the only thing preventing Allsopp from flattening Medic out here. And you can see we get a completely different version of Medic in this second round, where he isn't doing anywhere near as good of a job as popping back up to his feet as he did in round 1. So if we just skip through, we can see what basically happens is, after being taken down 35 seconds into round 2, Medic doesn't even come close to standing back up to his feet. He kind of just gives his back up and just accepts the rear naked choke. You can see him getting dragged back down here, but nowhere near as good defensively as he was in round 1. Looks exhausted and eventually gets choked out towards the end of round 2, when, to be fair, the forearm's not even really fully under the chin. So anyway, what is my point in all of this? What is my point? Well, the point I have in all of this is, it's a very complicated fight. Very complicated. Because it's largely going to come down to the cardio of both guys. And both guys have gassed bad under specific sets of circumstances that they're both capable of putting each other under. Let me explain. I've already explained. I'm going to summarize. Soriano's the kind of guy that will gas very fast if you make him work hard for takedowns and exert a lot of energy in grappling positions. That's a problem because early in fights, Medic showed us against Allsopp that he's difficult to take down and hold down. Therefore, Soriano could waste a bunch of energy trying to take Medic down in round 1 to not really achieve very much, other than burning through tons of energy, gassing himself out, which would result in Medic likely outstriking him in rounds 2 and 3. However, in the Allsopp fight, we've seen Medic basically gassed to the point where he can't defend himself in grappling positions anymore after just 5 minutes. So if Soriano's cardio is a decent amount better at welterweight, and if Soriano has the cardio the grapple had for 2 rounds instead of maybe 1 round, then you could see a situation where this fight plays out similarly to Medic Orolbai, where even though Soriano may struggle in round 1, perhaps he then starts to hit easy takedowns on Medic in round 2 and drown him in pressure on the ground with ground and pound like he did against Miguel Beza. So this is a very, very, very complex fight. It's a very good fight for live betting. Again, very optimistic we'll be able to make a profit and snipe a bet on this fight live. We make a profit on approximately 70% of UFC events over the last 9 years. These fights are where we have a huge edge because we know so much about both guys that when the fight is taking place live, we can put ourselves in strong positions to snipe those winners. But from a pre-fight betting point of view, it's risky to go with either of them. You can see how they've both got huge weaknesses that their opponent could potentially exploit. In that situation, this is clearly dog or pass. In my opinion, you'd have to be crazy to bet Medic as a big favourite at an implied probability of 67% based on the footage that I've just shown you. You may feel differently, but I don't know how you could feel comfortable betting Medic in that odds range based on his performance against Orolbai, based on what Soriano did to Beza. I'm not saying Medic can't win. I'm just saying I think this fight is way closer to 50-50 than the odds suggest. And so for me, this is clearly dog or pass. And Soriano is a very tempting bet. And I am very tempted to pull the trigger on him. But let me know what you think I should do. I haven't made my mind up on this one yet. I've basically presented all my research, all my findings to you. Let me know what you're going to do. Let me know. But I am pretty confident when I say it is dog or pass. So in terms of the over-under on this one, it's tricky, man. It is tricky. When you look at the odds, it's pretty big favourite odds on the fight not to go to decision. I'm guessing that's on the basis that one of these guys will probably gas pretty bad in this fight to the extent that they become too tired to defend themselves. So on that basis, I understand why fight not to go to a decision is pretty steep favourite odds. However, both guys, I don't know. I just don't like those odds. If I'm just playing the odds, I would prefer dog odds on that. You can see Soriano's been to a decision in 3 of his last 6. Medic never goes to a decision. It's tricky. I get it, man. I get it. I don't really have a confident read either way on the over-under on that one. In terms of most likely outcomes for the prop bets, Soriano 5.50 plus 450 to win by decisions. Interesting to me. But, yeah. The odds aren't massively better than Soriano to win money line in percentage terms. Maybe look at something like fight. The odds on fight ends in round 3 are absolute trash. So yeah, this one's looking like a bit dead for props. So I hope you found that useful. If you did, please hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Everyone says that in their YouTube videos, but I'm a small channel. I need some growth. I need to have these videos be worth the effort when I put them out. They're a lot of work and the channel growth is very slow. So I would really appreciate it if you could hit the like button and subscribe for me. Check out my website. Links in the description below. Join the team. Join the community. We're going to have a great 2025. Thank you very much for watching. Love you all. Take care. I'll be back for next week's card. Nice one, guys. Take care. Bye.